I was 25, still in the black dress I'd worn to bury my grandmother, when my father pulled me into the funeral home parking lot and told me her life savings were already gone. Not lost, not pending, gone. Moved out of her name 11 days before she died to keep my brother's restaurant open for one more month. I remember the salt stains still crusted on the curb from the last snow, and how he said it like he was reading off a weather report. They expected me to nod. They expected me to grieve quietly and never ask where the money went. What I did instead is the reason you're watching this. 18 months later, the restaurant they drained my grandmother's accounts to save folded anyway. They could live with that. What they couldn't survive came 11 years later, in a courtroom none of them saw coming, with my name on the witness list and theirs in my exhibits. Welcome back to Quiet Reckoning, where ordinary people hold their composure until the truth is finally ready to do the work for them. If a family has ever told you someone else's emergency mattered more than your future, stay with me to the end. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's start from the beginning. My name is Nora Hartley, and that parking lot conversation happened on a Tuesday in March, the sky the color of wet concrete. My father, Walt, had asked me to walk out to the cars with him, which in our family always meant he had something to say that he didn't trust my mother, Diane, to deliver without managing it first. He didn't ease into it. My dad has never been good at easing into anything. There's something about Grandma Ruth's accounts you need to know before the lawyer calls you, he said. Then he told me, the laundromats. The brokerage account she'd built 1/4 at a time over 40 years. All of it had been moved, months earlier, to cover the note on my brother Derek's second restaurant location before the bank called the loan. I asked when. He looked at the salt stains instead of at me. March of last year, he said. Then, quieter, like it cost him something to finish the sentence. The last transfer went through 11 days before she passed. I did the math, without meaning to. She'd still been alive then. Not lucid. She hadn't recognized her own kitchen in months by that point. But alive, breathing in a memory care bed 40 minutes from where we stood, while somebody sat at a desk and moved her money out of her own name. I asked the only question that mattered. Did she know? My father studied his shoes. She wasn't really in a place to know things by then, he said, which wasn't an answer. It was a confession dressed up as one. I didn't cry in that parking lot, and I want to be honest with you about why. I didn't have any tears to spare yet. I asked for account numbers. I asked for dates. I asked the way I ask everything, like I was building a file before I knew I'd need one. My father seemed almost relieved by the questions. Numbers, it turned out, were easier for him to survive than feelings. He didn't understand yet that for me, those had always been the same thing. To understand why that conversation landed the way it did, you have to understand what those accounts actually were. My grandmother, Ruth Calloway, buried her husband at 31 and raised my mother alone on a laundromat she bought with his life insurance money and never once apologized for running like a business instead of a hobby. By the time I was born, she had 3 locations across 2 counties, machines eating quarters from 6 in the morning until 11 at night, and a habit of counting the till herself every single Sunday because, in her words, nobody minds your money the way you mind it yourself. She let me help her count starting when I was 7. Not Derek, me. I'd sit on a folding stool behind the counter at her Route 9 location, sorting rolls of dimes while she checked my addition against hers, and if I got it wrong, she made me find my own mistake instead of just telling me where it was. Derek came once, got bored inside of 10 minutes, and went to play in the parking lot. She never asked him again. She used to tell people I was the only one in the family who balanced a ledger without being asked twice, and she said it like it was the highest compliment in her vocabulary. When she wrote her will, she didn't split things evenly, and she didn't pretend to. Derek got her car, a 1998 Buick she'd babied more carefully than some people baby children, along with her jewelry, most of it inherited from her own mother. I got the laundromats, or whatever came from selling them, and the brokerage account she'd quietly grown from 40 years of saved quarters and patient, unglamorous investing. Her attorney told me after the funeral that she'd added a line to her file that wasn't legally binding, but that he felt he owed it to her to read aloud anyway. She'd written, Nora checks the math. Let her have something worth checking. That was the money my parents moved, not some vague family cushion. A specific, named gift, intended for the one grandchild who'd spent her childhood on a folding stool learning that numbers don't lie even when the people standing next to them do. It would be easy to tell you my parents simply woke up one day and chose Derek. The truth is slower than that, and it had been building for years before any of us could see exactly where it was heading. Derek got a used Civic at 16, financed over 2 years. I got a bus pass and a lecture about gratitude. When he wanted to open his first restaurant at 28, my father co-signed the loan without asking my mother to read the terms first. When a second location came together faster than the first one could actually support, my mother took out a home equity line to cover the build-out and called it believing in him. Every single time, the word vision did the heavy lifting. Derek had vision. I had, according to family legend, stability, which in our house was a polite word for less interesting. I never resented him for being loved. You don't get to choose how your parents love you, and I don't think he asked to be the favorite any more than I asked to be the safe one. What I resented, slowly, over years I didn't fully add up until I was old enough to do the arithmetic, was how love in that house always seemed to travel in one direction, and how often it routed straight through my side of the ledger to get there. There was something else that week, something I only half registered at the time. Whenever I asked a direct question about Derek's restaurant, how the second location was actually financed, what the real monthly note looked like, my mother changed the subject the way you change the channel during bad news. That's not something I need you weighing in on, she told me once, to a daughter who, within a year, would become a far more informed critic of that loan than either of my parents ever managed to be. I didn't know yet exactly what they were protecting. I only recognized the shape of it. Careful, urgent, the particular quiet that gathers around a wound nobody wants examined too closely. Whatever Derek's restaurant actually owed, my parents weren't just helping anymore. They were braced against something, and I was about to find out precisely what. I want you to know I didn't just accept it. The week after the funeral, I drove to an elder law attorney 2 towns over, the kind of office with a fish tank in the waiting room and a receptionist who already seemed to know, before I sat down, exactly why a 25-year-old in a black blazer had made the appointment. I laid out everything. The power of attorney Grandma had signed 4 years earlier, back when she was sharp enough to balance her own books, naming my mother as her financial agent. The transfers. The dates. The fact that the last one happened 11 days before she died, while she was, by every medical record I'd eventually see, incapable of understanding what was being moved or why. The attorney listened, took careful notes, and then told me the truth as gently as a hard truth can be told. The power of attorney document was broad. Painfully broad. It had been drafted years before anyone expected it to be tested, back when nobody in that room could have imagined it would one day be used against the very person who'd signed it. Proving a breach would mean suing my own mother, building a case my grieving family would have to live inside for years, with no guarantee the money would ever come back, because most of it, by then, was already spent. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. The agreement was strong enough to let them do what they did. It just wasn't strong enough to stop it. I sat in my car in his parking lot for a long time afterward. I hadn't been naive. I'd checked. I'd shown up at the right office with the right paperwork and asked exactly the right questions, and the trap had still been airtight because it had been built years earlier, on a piece of paper my grandmother signed out of love and trust, never once imagining whose hands it would eventually serve. I drove back to Belmont with the windows down even though it was barely 50 degrees, because I needed the cold to keep me from doing something I'd regret. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, I'd already made the only decision that made sense to me. If my future wasn't safe in that house, I wasn't going to keep storing what was left of it there. I didn't make a scene, and I think that disappointed my mother more than a scene would have. She kept waiting for the explosion that would let her feel like the reasonable one in the story. I never gave it to her. I packed what was actually mine, my books, the cedar box of Grandma's recipe cards she'd given me years before any of this started, my CPA exam materials, 3 years of careful budgeting kept in a battered accordion folder, and I loaded my car in under an hour. My mother, Diane, stood in the doorway and said I was punishing them during the hardest year of their lives. My father said I'd regret throwing away family over money. I stopped on the porch with the last box and looked at both of them. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said. I'm doing it because I'm done waiting around for something that was never actually going to be mine to keep. I drove the 2 hours to Indianapolis on a half tank of gas, toward a friend's couch, and absolutely no plan beyond that. And somewhere past the county line, Belmont shrank into my rearview mirror. The water tower, the grain elevator, the restaurant my grandmother's life savings had gone to keep alive for one more month, until it was just a smudge on a flat Indiana highway behind me. If you've ever packed a car in under an hour because staying had finally stopped making sense, you already know exactly how loud that kind of quiet gets. Go ahead and tap subscribe before we keep going, because the next part is where the real math starts, and I promise you the numbers do not land where my parents thought they would. Indianapolis didn't roll out a welcome mat. I took the first job I could get, a seasonal position at a small tax prep firm doing data entry for a CPA named Dorothy Voss, a woman who chain-drank black coffee and trusted no one's math, including her own, until she'd checked it twice. It turned out to be a language I already spoke fluently. I studied for the CPA exam at my kitchen table between shifts for sections, 18 months, one cheap legal pad at a time. I knew the price of every grocery item I bought because I had to. I split a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate I barely saw and put whatever survived the month into a savings account I refused to touch, the same way Grandma used to count a till on a Sunday, because nobody minds your money the way you mind it yourself. Dorothy noticed before anyone else did. She'd hand me a client's shoebox of disorganized receipts, and I'd come back 2 days later with a clean reconciliation and a short list of things that didn't add up, things she hadn't even asked me to look for. "That's not normal," she told me once, only half joking. "Most people stop the second the numbers balance. You keep going until you understand why they almost didn't." I never told Dorothy about the laundromats or the parking lot or a power of attorney signed for years before anyone needed it to fail someone. I didn't need to. I'd already learned the lesson it was teaching me, that the people who get hurt by bad paperwork are usually the ones who trusted at least and read at last. I passed all 4 sections of the exam on the first try, alone in my apartment on an ordinary Tuesday night, and I cried for the first time since the funeral. Not from grief. From something closer to arrival. My family assumed I'd come back by the holidays. They didn't understand that I'd already done the hardest part. Everything after leaving was just arithmetic, and arithmetic had never once scared me. News still traveled the way it does from a small town, sideways, through a cousin's offhand comment, or a neighbor who friend you online just to keep tabs. That's how I learned, 18 months after the funeral, that the second iron skillet location had quietly closed. A notice on the door. A liquidation sale of fryers and stainless tables. No announcement to the extended family at all. My cousin Mia called to tell me, and she didn't bother softening it. "They put everything into saving that place," she said, "and it folded anyway." I felt something I hadn't expected, not triumph, something colder and cleaner than that. They had spent my grandmother's whole life's work to buy Derek 11 more months, and the 11 months had changed nothing. The money was simply gone, the way water is gone after it runs straight through your hands. A package arrived from Mia the following spring, no warning, postmarked from a town I hadn't lived in for almost 2 years. Inside, wrapped in a dish towel I recognized instantly from Grandma's kitchen, was a black and white marble composition notebook, its spine cracked from use, the cover gone soft with age. Mia's note said she'd found it in a box at the Route 9 laundromat, finally sold that winter to cover one of my parents' remaining debts, while she helped clear out the back office before the new owner took over. "Nobody else even knew what it was," she wrote. "I knew you'd want it." I sat at my kitchen table and opened it slowly. It was Ruth's real book, not the one she showed the accountant every spring, but the one she kept for herself. Decades of handwritten columns in pencil, every quarter, every repair, every slow Tuesday, tracked in her own careful hand. Near the back, tucked into the binding, was a folded envelope holding $3,000 in worn 20s, the kind of money saved a little at a time across years, and a single index card. "You always checked my math," it read. "Now go check theirs." I sat with that for a long time. I remember being 7 years old on a folding stool, finding a $2 error in a roll of dimes, and feeling like I'd discovered something the entire world needed to know. I remembered her hand closing over mine. She had known, even then, exactly which grandchild would eventually need a head start nobody could vote her out of giving. I didn't cry over the money. I cried because someone who'd been gone for 2 years had still managed to hand me exactly what I needed at exactly the moment I needed it. The next morning, I taped the index card above my desk, where I would read it almost every day for the next decade. I had no idea yet how literally I'd end up following its instructions. The $3,000 didn't make me rich, and I want to be honest about that because I've never trusted stories where a windfall solves everything. It covered 4 months of rent while I cut my hours at Dorothy's firm and took an unpaid internship at a regional practice that did something I hadn't even known existed: forensic accounting, the kind of work where you don't just balance a company's books, you figure out exactly where and how and why they stopped balancing in the first place. It turned out I had a talent for it that went well past competence. I could look at a set of financial statements the way some people look at a photograph and see immediately what had been cropped out of the frame. I earned my certified fraud examiner credential at 28, working full days and studying nights, the same rhythm that had carried me through the CPA exam because by then it was simply how I built things. I stayed at that regional firm for 4 years, working cases nobody glamorizes, a nonprofit whose treasurer had quietly skimmed bake sale money for a decade, a family construction company keeping 2 sets of payroll books. Then, at 32, with 3 former clients willing to follow me and a business plan I'd rewritten more times than I'd ever admit, I opened my own practice. I called it Meridian Forensic Group, a name with nothing of my family in it on purpose. Meridian grew the way real things actually grow, unglamorously. A good quarter followed by a slow one, then 2 good quarters, then a plateau that taught me patience I didn't know I had. By 35, I had a dozen employees, a modest building downtown with the company's name on the glass door, and a reputation, county by county, as the forensic accountant you called when you needed someone to find the truth inside a set of numbers and say it out loud, without flinching. I never announced any of this to my family. That was deliberate. In a family that ran on stories, the most powerful thing I owned was my refusal to hand them new material. The calls from home never fully stopped. They just changed shape. My mother's voice carried the same careful blend of warmth and pressure it always had. "We miss you," she'd say, and almost in the same breath, "Your brother's going through a hard stretch right now," as if my absence were something being done to them, rather than something they'd built one transfer at a time into the only road I had left. I answered direct questions. I didn't feed the guilt. When my mother fished for details about what I was up to these days, I gave her nothing she could repackage into a story about a daughter who'd finally done well enough to come home and help. Derek and I spoke maybe twice a year, almost always logistics, never anything that came near a funeral home parking lot or an index card on a wall. His wife, Brooke, posted often online about family loyalty, the kind of caption that nearly always ended with the same 3 words: family helps family. I didn't engage. Silence, I'd learned, isn't the same thing as absence. It's a wall you build on purpose, with a door only you control. I told myself for years that the chapter was closed. I almost believed it. Then, 11 years after that conversation in the funeral home parking lot, my office phone rang on an ordinary Thursday, and the chapter turned out to have only been waiting for an occasion. The caller was a woman named Pam Alston. I knew her name before she'd finished introducing herself. The Alstons had gone to my parents' church my entire childhood, the kind of family whose Christmas card sat on our refrigerator every December. Her voice was careful, almost apologetic, like she already suspected she was about to put me in an impossible position. "Tom and I put nearly all of our retirement into Derek's gym," she said. "Ironclad Fitness. 3 locations, founding memberships, investor shares, the whole pitch. 18 months in, 2 locations are dark, the 3rd's behind on rent, and our lawyer says the money isn't where Derek told us it would be." I already knew where this was going before she said the next part out loud. "We need someone to trace where it actually went," she said. "Somebody good. Somebody who won't soften it for us, because of who's involved. We thought of you first, actually, because of who's involved. We trust you, Nora. We always have." I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, looking at the index card still taped above my desk. The ink faded, but every word still perfectly legible. "Now go check theirs." I told Pam I needed to think about it, and I meant it, because taking that case meant doing professionally on the public record, exactly what I'd refused to do personally for 11 years. open my family's books, and read every line out loud. I didn't take it lightly, and I didn't take it quietly. I called the Alstons' attorney myself first and disclosed everything. That Derek was my brother, that I hadn't had a real conversation with my parents in over a decade, that I'd happily recommend a colleague instead if that made anyone more comfortable. He told me he'd rather have the best forensic accountant in the state with a fully disclosed conflict than a stranger with none, and that the Alstons had specifically asked for me, knowing exactly who I was. So I signed the engagement letter and went to work the only way I know how, methodically, without anger, the way Grandma taught me to count a till before anyone got to tell me what was supposedly in it. What I found, over 6 weeks of bank statements, loan documents, and investor agreements, was a pattern I recognized before I'd even finished the first folder, because I'd watched its earliest draft 11 years before from a funeral home parking lot. Derek had raised nearly $400,000 from 14 investors, most of them family friends, several of them people who'd known me since I was a kid sorting dimes on a folding stool. Roughly a third of that money had never touched the gym at all. It had gone to personal credit cards, to a truck payment, and I sat very still when I reached this line, to 2 wire transfers that had quietly covered my parents' mortgage for 4 months the year before, the same mortgage they'd already refinanced once, the same year Grandma's last laundromat finally sold. The money had never actually stopped flowing in one direction. It had only changed which business it was pretending to save. I built the report the way I build every report, with dates, with source documents, with nothing in it I couldn't defend under oath, because somewhere in those 6 weeks I'd stopped thinking of this as my family's story and started treating it as exactly what it was, a financial record. And financial records, unlike people, don't get to lie about what actually happened. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in October, in a conference room 2 floors above the same county courthouse, where I'd once listened to Grandma's Will Get Read Aloud. I wore a gray suit instead of the black dress from the funeral home parking lot, which felt, in some small private way, like exactly the right kind of progress. My parents attended as fact witnesses, since the plaintiff's attorney wanted to establish a pattern of financial conduct going back years, starting with a power of attorney signed long before any of us imagined it would ever matter. Derek sat at the defense table beside his attorney, not quite looking at me, the way you avoid looking directly at whether you can't control. I'd given expert testimony before in smaller cases, quieter rooms. This one felt different the moment I sat down, not because the dollar amounts were higher, they weren't, not by much, but because for the first time in 11 years, every person in that room who had ever told me someone else's need mattered more than mine was going to sit still and listen to me speak without interrupting, without changing the subject, without telling me it wasn't something I needed to weigh in on. I opened my binder. I'd labeled every exhibit the night before, the same way I'd labeled boxes in a closet a lifetime ago. This time, nothing in that binder was leaving the room with anyone but me. I walked the table through it in order because order is the only thing that makes complicated money make sense to people who didn't build the mess in the first place. I started with the gym, the investor agreements, the founding memberships, the third of every dollar that never reached a single barbell or square foot of leased floor. Then I went back further because the pattern needed a first page, and 11 years is exactly long enough for people to forget it had one. I described a power of attorney signed by my grandmother 4 years before her decline. I described 3 laundromats and a brokerage account willed specifically to me. I described a final transfer, dated and verified, that moved out of her name 11 days before she died. The room went very still. My mother's hand found my father's on the table in front of her, the same fold of fingers I remembered from a kitchen I hadn't sat in for over a decade. Derek's attorney objected, then tried, on cross-examination, to do what I think he genuinely believed would rattle me. "Isn't it true, Miss Hartley," he said, "that you have a personal grievance against this family? Isn't it true you're not really a neutral expert here at all?" I answered the way I'd answered every question that day, evenly, without raising my voice. I disclosed my relationship to the defendant before I accepted this engagement, I said. I disclosed it to your client's attorney and to the Alstons before I opened a single file. Everything in my report is sourced to a date, a document, or a bank record. If you'd like to challenge my conclusions, I'll walk through any line you choose. If you'd like to challenge my family history, I understand it's complicated. But it isn't in dispute, and I don't think you want me to explain why on the record. He didn't ask a follow-up question. He sat back down instead, and in trying to make the case about old wounds, he'd managed to enter the entire 11-year pattern into the official transcript more cleanly than the plaintiff's own attorney could have done alone. Every transfer, every bridge, every single time someone in my family had quietly decided that somebody else's business mattered more than the person standing closest to them. I looked at my parents only once, near the end. My mother wasn't crying the way she had years earlier, loud enough for a restaurant full of people to hear. She was just staring at the binder in front of me like she'd finally understood it, had been there the entire time, waiting, patient as a Sunday count. The fallout was exactly as measurable as these things get once a forensic report becomes part of a public record. Derek settled with the Alstons and the other investors rather than risk a trial, signing over what little equity remained in Ironclad Fitness and agreeing to a repayment schedule that will outlast the gym memberships by close to a decade. He sold his house. I heard secondhand that he's working for a regional supply company now on salary, with someone else's name on the building. My parents weren't named as defendants, but the deposition transcript became part of the public record anyway, and small towns read public records the way other places read the morning paper. They kept their house, technically, but only by finally tightening their own finances instead of reaching into someone else's, which I've come to believe is the thing they could have done at literally any point along the way. A few relatives reached out afterward, quietly, to say they'd never known the real story. My Aunt Carol called and didn't bring up the case at all. She just asked how I was doing, which somehow meant more than an apology would have. Mia and I are closer than we've ever been. I thought about Brooke's old captions once or twice that month. Family helps family. I just spent 6 weeks proving, line by line, exactly what that phrase had cost everyone in it who wasn't Derek. My parents call sometimes now, careful and stiff, mentioning the weather, asking after Meridian like it's a polite topic instead of a company built directly out of the wreckage of what they took. I answer. I keep it short. I don't carry guilt about keeping it short anymore, and that, more than any settlement, is the part that actually feels like winning. I still have Grandma's marble notebook. It sits on a shelf in my office now, behind glass, beside a small framed photo of a folding stool I had specially made because I thought she'd find that funny. The index card is still taped above my desk, soft at the corners after 11 years of being read. Now go check theirs. I did. I checked it under oath, with my full name on the transcript, and nobody in that room could say I hadn't told the truth. People sometimes ask if I feel guilty testifying against my own brother sitting across a deposition table from the people who raised me. I tell them the most honest answer I have. I never put a single number in that report that wasn't already true before I arrived. I just finally refused to be the only person in my family willing to pretend otherwise. I drove home from that deposition the same way I'd driven out of Belmont 11 years earlier. Windows down, county roads, no plan beyond the next mile. But this time my hands weren't shaking, and there was nothing behind me I needed to look back at. The water tower, the grain elevator, the restaurant, the gym, the house my parents kept by finally learning what it cost to keep it, all of it stayed exactly where it was, in a town that had once decided which of its children mattered more, while I drove toward a life they had never once managed to put a price on. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of this, it's that an apology costs nothing to give and everything to actually mean, and money my parents could move with a single signature. The truth needed 11 years, a folding stool's worth of patience, and somebody willing to check the math all the way to the end. Sorry has never once balanced a single account I've audited. It didn't balance this one either. Here's the question I'll leave you with tonight. If the people who once told you someone else's need mattered more than yours came back years later needing exactly the skill they refused to let you build for yourself, would you pick up the phone? Where's the line between doing your job and finally getting to say the truth out loud? And would you have drawn it where I did? Tell me in the comments where you'd have drawn that line. If this one hit home, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe for more stories like Nora's, the quiet ones that take their time and still land exactly where they're supposed to.